The gentle summer breeze carried the mouth-watering aroma of grilled burgers and sweet corn across our backyard. It was supposed to be a perfect Sunday afternoon, the kind where family memories are made over good food and hearty laughter. My wife and I had spent weeks planning this neighborhood barbecue, hoping to build bridges with our new neighbors since moving into the suburban community 3 months ago. I was at the grill, carefully flipping the burgers while my kids ran through the sprinkler, their squeals of delight filling the air. That's when I heard the sharp voice cutting through the cheerful atmosphere. "This has to stop right now." Our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, stood at the edge of our property, her face twisted in an expression I'd grown unfortunately familiar with over the past few months. She never made it a secret that she wasn't happy about our family moving into the neighborhood. There were always complaints our kids were too loud, our music wasn't appropriate, our gardening style didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. But today, something was different. Today, she'd brought reinforcements, 2 other neighbors I'd never spoken to, and they were all holding what looked like a stack of papers. "This gathering is unauthorized," Mrs. Thompson announced loudly, drawing attention from the few guests who'd already arrived. "According to the HOA bylaws." She waved the papers dramatically, but I couldn't help noticing how her hands trembled slightly. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment ever since we moved in. My wife squeezed my hand as I stepped away from the grill, wiping my hands on my world's okayest chef apron, a Father's Day gift from my kids. 20 years of experience as a community mediator had taught me that moments like these weren't really about bylaws or noise complaints. They were about fear, misunderstanding, and the walls people build around their hearts. What happened next would leave not just Mrs. Thompson, but the entire neighborhood speechless. You see, sometimes the best way to tear down walls isn't with sledgehammers, but with something far more powerful, something I'd learned from years of bringing divided communities together. As I walked toward our upset neighbors, I carried with me not just my professional experience, but a secret that would transform this confrontation into something none of them expected. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as I stopped a few feet away from Mrs. Thompson. The other neighbors shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that this situation wasn't going to play out the way they'd anticipated. Behind me, I could hear my children's laughter fade as they picked up on the growing tension. My wife had taught them well. They knew exactly what to do in moments like these. Little did Mrs. Thompson know, but her attempt to shut down our family barbecue was about to backfire in the most extraordinary way. As I opened my mouth to speak, I held not just words, but a key that would unlock decades of neighborhood history she thought long buried. Sometimes, the greatest changes come from the most unexpected moments, and this Sunday afternoon was about to become a day our community would never forget. The story of what happened next would spread far beyond our little suburb, touching hearts and changing minds in ways none of us could have predicted. But first, let me take you back to where it all really began, 3 months ago, when we first moved in and I discovered something in our home's old records that would change everything. It was during those first few days of unpacking when I stumbled upon a dusty folder tucked away in the back of our basement storage. Most people would have tossed it aside with the other previous owner's leftover paperwork, but something caught my eye, a familiar name, Thompson. Not just any Thompson, but Richard Thompson, dated 1965. As I read through the yellowed pages, my hands trembled with the weight of what I'd discovered. Richard Thompson, Mrs. Thompson's late father-in-law, had been the neighborhood's most vocal advocate for integration during the civil rights era. The folder contained letters, newspaper clippings, and meeting minutes showing how he'd fought tirelessly to make our suburb one of the first in the area to welcome families of all backgrounds. He'd faced death threats, social ostracism, and even attempts to force him out of his position on the city council. But he never backed down. The irony was almost painful. Mrs. Thompson, who'd inherited his house next door, had no idea about her father-in-law's legacy. Or maybe she did, and that made it even worse. I'd spent weeks debating whether to share this information, wondering if it would make any difference. As a mediator, I'd learned that timing was everything when it came to difficult conversations. Back at the barbecue, I could see my wife giving me that look, the one that said she trusted whatever I was about to do. Our oldest had moved protectively in front of their younger siblings, while our guests watched the scene unfold with a mix of concern and curiosity. The smell of slightly burning burgers reminded me I needed to handle this quickly. "Mrs. Thompson," I began, my voice calm and steady, "before you continue with those papers, there's something I'd like to show you. Something that belongs to your family." I could see confusion flicker across her face, momentarily replacing her stern expression. The two neighbors flanking her exchanged uncertain glances. Just then, Mr. Chen from across the street stepped forward. He was one of the few neighbors who'd welcomed us warmly, and I'd shared my discovery with him last week. He'd lived here for 40 years and remembered Richard Thompson well. The slight nod he gave me confirmed what we'd discussed: sometimes the past holds the key to unlocking the present. I turned back toward our house, gesturing for Mrs. Thompson to follow. "What I'm about to show you might explain why we chose this house, this neighborhood, and why this barbecue is about more than just burgers and hot dogs." My voice carried across the now silent yard, drawing everyone's attention. "It's about continuing a legacy that started right here, in your family." The confusion on Mrs. Thompson's face deepened, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I saw something else there too: a flicker of curiosity. The papers in her hands lowered slightly. Behind her, the other neighbors were whispering, probably wondering what could possibly connect our family to the Thompsons' past. As we walked toward my home office where I'd kept the folder, I could hear the murmur of conversation resuming in the backyard. My wife had taken over the grill, saving our burgers from becoming charcoal, and our kids had cautiously returned to their play. But this moment between Mrs. Thompson and me, this was about to change everything. What I didn't know then was that the contents of that folder would do more than just reveal a forgotten piece of history. They would spark a chain of events that would transform not just our relationship with Mrs. Thompson, but the entire neighborhood's understanding of what it means to be a community. As I led Mrs. Thompson into my home office, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The two neighbors who'd accompanied her hovered uncertainly at the doorway, their curiosity clearly getting the better of their previous hostility. My hands were steady as I reached for the folder I'd stored carefully in my desk drawer, but my heart was racing. Everything hinged on what would happen next. "Before I show you this," I said, turning to face Mrs. Thompson, "I want you to know that I've spent 20 years bringing communities together, helping people see past their differences. But what I found in this folder taught me more about this neighborhood than any training ever could." Her expression remained guarded, but I noticed how her eyes fixed on the aged yellow folder in my hands. Mr. Chen had quietly joined us, standing in the doorway. He cleared his throat and spoke softly. "Sarah, you were just a young bride when you married into the Thompson family. There's so much about your father-in-law that you never knew." Mrs. Thompson's head snapped up at the mention of her father-in-law, her eyes widening slightly. As I carefully opened the folder, a small black and white photograph slipped out, floating to the floor. Mrs. Thompson reached for it before I could move. The moment she saw it, her hand flew to her mouth. The photograph showed a younger Richard Thompson standing proudly in front of our house, her current home, with a diverse group of families, all smiling despite the obvious tension of the era. That's impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Richard never." She couldn't finish her sentence as her eyes fell on the stack of letters I was now holding. Letters that would reveal just how wrong she was about her father-in-law's legacy. Just then, we heard commotion from the backyard. More neighbors had arrived for the barbecue, their voices carrying through the open windows. Among them, I recognized the voice of Mrs. Green, the oldest resident of our street, and, as I'd recently learned, someone who'd worked closely with Richard Thompson during those challenging years. Mrs. Thompson's hands were shaking as she began to read the first letter. Her two supporters had moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The letter was dated June 1965, and with each line, I could see the color draining from her face. But it wasn't just what was in that first letter that would shake her world, it was what came next. I reached for the newspaper clippings, carefully preserved despite their age. Mrs. Thompson, your father-in-law didn't just support integration in this neighborhood. Before I could finish, Mrs. Green appeared in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the papers in our hands. The look on her face said it all. She knew exactly what we'd discovered. The next few moments would change everything. As Mrs. Thompson turned to the second page of her father-in-law's letter, a small key fell from between the pages. A key that would unlock not just a hidden drawer in her own home, but a truth that had been buried for over half a century. A truth that would force everyone in that room and eventually, our entire neighborhood to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. What happened next wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about how one man's courage 50 years ago was about to bridge the divide between generations, between neighbors, and between the different worlds we all thought we lived in. And it all started with what Mrs. Thompson was about to read on the next page. As Mrs. Thompson's eyes scanned the second page, her knees buckled slightly. Mr. Chin quickly pulled up a chair for her. The letter revealed something none of us had expected. Richard Thompson hadn't just advocated for neighborhood integration, he'd secretly used his position at the local bank to help qualified families secure home loans when other institutions turned them away because of their race or background. It was a risk that could have cost him everything in those days. But that's not even the biggest revelation. Mrs. Green spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of decades. Richard Thompson created a neighborhood trust fund. A fund that still exists today, Sarah. Mrs. Thompson's head snapped up at this information. The two neighbors who'd come with her exchanged shocked glances. This was clearly news to everyone in the room. The key that had fallen from the papers wasn't just any key, it opened a safe deposit box at the local bank where Richard Thompson had worked. A box that, according to his letters, contained documents that would ensure his vision for the neighborhood would continue long after he was gone. Mrs. Thompson was listed as the legal heir, but she'd never known about it. Just then, my wife appeared in the doorway, concern etched on her face. "Everyone's wondering what's going on," she said softly. Well, there's something else you all need to see." She gestured toward the backyard, where the barbecue guests had gathered around something or someone. Through the window, I could make out an elderly figure I'd never seen before. Mrs. Thompson stood up, the letters clutched to her chest, and moved to the window. Her sharp intake of breath told me she recognized the visitor. That's impossible," she whispered for the second time that day. "That's Mr. Rodriguez. He moved away 30 years ago after." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Mrs. Green could. After the incident that drove Richard Thompson to create the trust fund, Mrs. Green completed. "He was the first family your father-in-law helped, Sarah. And if he's here today, after all these years..." Her voice trailed off meaningfully. The implications hung heavy in the air. The barbecue that Mrs. Thompson had tried to shut down was transforming into something none of us could have predicted. As we all moved toward the backyard, I noticed Mr. Rodriguez holding what appeared to be an old leather briefcase. One that, by the way Mrs. Thompson's face paled, she clearly recognized. "He always kept that briefcase in his study," she murmured, almost to herself. "I never knew what was in it. After he passed, it disappeared. I thought." She stopped walking abruptly, causing us all to pause. "I thought my husband had thrown it away with Dad's other controversial papers." What we didn't know then was that Mr. Rodriguez's appearance wasn't a coincidence. He'd seen our family move in, and he'd been watching the neighborhood's reaction. He'd been waiting for the right moment to return, carrying with him the final piece of Richard Thompson's legacy, a piece that would force everyone to confront not just the past, but their own role in the present. As we stepped back into the sunlight, the crowd parted to let us through. Mr. Rodriguez stood there, his weathered hands resting on the briefcase that held secrets none of us were prepared for. The look he exchanged with Mrs. Green spoke of decades of shared history, of untold stories waiting to be revealed. And when he finally spoke, his words would set in motion a chain of events that would make our simple family barbecue the catalyst for something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Rodriguez's voice carried across the now silent backyard as he began to speak. "Sarah," he addressed Mrs. Thompson directly, "your father-in-law made me promise to return this briefcase when the right time came. When I saw this family move in, facing the same resistance we did 30 years ago, I knew that time was now." His hands moved to the briefcase's clasps with deliberate slowness. Inside lay not just documents, but a series of photographs that told a story of friendship across racial lines that had been deliberately erased from the neighborhood's history. There were pictures of backyard gatherings much like ours, with Richard Thompson and Mr. Rodriguez's family, along with other families of different backgrounds, all sharing meals together. But it was the legal document beneath these photos that caused Mrs. Thompson to sink into a nearby chair. "It's the original deed to the neighborhood park," Mrs. Green explained to the gathering crowd. "The park that's been closed for renovation for the past 5 years." She paused, letting the significance sink in. That park had been the subject of heated debate recently, with some neighbors pushing to make it a private, residents-only space with restricted access. What Richard Thompson's documents revealed was that the park had been legally designated as a public space in perpetuity, with a substantial trust fund set aside for its maintenance, a fund that had grown to over $500,000 over the decades. The renovation signs had been part of a deliberate attempt by some current board members to circumvent the original deed. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled as she read through the papers. "My husband. He knew about this," she whispered. "That's why he resigned from the board last year. He couldn't bring himself to tell me." Her voice broke as tears began rolling down her cheeks. The two neighbors who'd accompanied her earlier quietly slipped away, their faces flushed with shame. But Mr. Rodriguez wasn't finished. From the bottom of the briefcase, he pulled out one final envelope, sealed and addressed to the future of our community. Inside was a letter dated just weeks before Richard Thompson's death, along with a USB drive. As I connected it to my laptop, which someone quickly brought out, the gathered crowd pressed closer. The screen flickered to life with a video that left everyone speechless. There was Richard Thompson, looking directly into the camera, recording his final message. "If you're watching this," his voice rang clear despite the years, "it means our neighborhood is at a crossroads again. The trust fund isn't just for the park, it's for fostering unity in our community. Every year, it's meant to sponsor events that bring people together. Events exactly like this barbecue." Mrs. Thompson stood up suddenly, realization dawning on her face. "The anonymous donation that helped you buy this house," she said, turning to me. "It wasn't random, was it?" I shook my head slowly. The trust fund had quietly been helping selected families move into the neighborhood for years, continuing Richard Thompson's legacy. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our backyard, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Thompson walked over to the grill, picked up the spatula I'd abandoned earlier, and began flipping burgers. "My father-in-law knew how to bring people together," she announced, her voice still shaky but growing stronger. "It's time I learned to do the same." But the most surprising twist came from what happened next, something that would cement this day in our neighborhood's history and set a precedent for communities across the country. As Mrs. Thompson served the first burger to my youngest child, she revealed one final secret from her father-in-law's legacy, a secret that would transform not just our neighborhood, but become a blueprint for positive change in communities everywhere. The real power of the trust fund, Mrs. Thompson revealed, serving burgers to the gathered neighbors, isn't just in its monetary value. My father-in-law set up a matching grant program. For every dollar our community raises for inclusion initiatives, the trust matches it threefold. She paused, letting that sink in. "We've been sitting on this opportunity for years, too caught up in our fears to see the potential." The revelation sparked an immediate response. Mr. Chin, who'd been quietly observing until now, stepped forward. My restaurant chain would be honored to sponsor monthly community dinners, he announced. Others quickly followed suit, offers of support, ideas for community projects, and genuine commitments to change poured in from all directions. As the evening wore on, our simple barbecue transformed into an impromptu community planning session. Children played together on the lawn, their laughter providing the perfect backdrop to the adults' earnest conversations about the future. The invisible barriers that had divided our neighborhood for so long began to crumble, one conversation at a time. Mrs. Thompson became the most surprising champion of change. "I've spent years protecting what I thought was my father-in-law's legacy," she admitted, sitting beside my wife and me as the stars began to appear. "In reality, I was betraying everything he stood for." She watched as her own grandchildren, who'd arrived later in the evening, played tag with our kids. Sometimes it takes seeing through fresh eyes to recognize our own blindness. The story of our barbecue spread beyond our neighborhood, catching the attention of local news and community organizations. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines, it was in the small changes that followed. The park renovation signs came down the very next week. Within a month, the first community trust-sponsored event brought together families from all corners of our city. Mr. Rodriguez became a regular visitor, sharing stories of the neighborhood's history with anyone who would listen. His briefcase, now emptied of its secrets, found a permanent home in the community center we established in the park's renovated pavilion, a reminder of how one person's courage can ripple through generations. As for Mrs. Thompson and me, we developed an unlikely friendship. Every Sunday, she joins our family BBQs, teaching my kids her secret recipe for potato salad while sharing stories about their grandfather-in-law they never knew. "He would have loved this," she often says, watching the neighborhood children play together in our joined backyards, the fence between our properties long since removed. The Trust Fund's matching grant program has now become a model for other communities across the country. But more importantly, it's taught us all that true change doesn't come from documents or dollars, it comes from people willing to open their hearts and minds to new possibilities. Looking back at that tense moment when Mrs. Thompson stormed into our barbecue with those HOA papers, I realized that sometimes the biggest obstacles in life are actually doorways to something better. All it takes is the courage to walk through them, and the wisdom to recognize that we're all part of a bigger story. Today, our neighborhood stands as a testament to Richard Thompson's vision, not because of the trust fund he left behind, but because his daughter-in-law finally understood what he'd known all along, that the strongest communities are built not by keeping people out, but by welcoming them in. And it all started with a simple family barbecue, a dusty folder, and the courage to believe that change is always possible, one burger and one conversation at a time. Sometimes the best family recipes aren't just about food, they're about bringing people together, breaking down walls, and creating something beautiful from the ingredients we're given. That's the real secret that was in Richard Thompson's briefcase all along, and it's a legacy we're all now proud to carry forward.